Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. Today I want to cover the case of the Queen in Short. It's a 2016 Ontario decision, and this one's interesting for a number of reasons. First, it's about a prison knife fight. Second, it's a self-defense case, and lots of people are interested in self-defense and what the rules are around that. And third, it's a case with a lot of judicial snark. The judge has some opinions. So let's have a look at this one and see what's going on. We'll just bring it up here. Begins, what happens when a maximum security facility produces maximum insecurity? Michael Short was a guest of Her Majesty in Right of Ontario at the Toronto East Detention Centre on February 16, 2015. And this is language that you'll often hear judges and lawyers talk about. A guest of Her Majesty. He's in prison. Having been convicted of robbery shortly before that date. The East Detention Centre, or the East as it is often called, is a remand and correctional facility administered by the province, so I guess a jail rather than a prison. On the date in question, Mr. Short was attacked by another inmate while taking a stroll through the 3A East day room. A third inmate served as a lookout for prison guards and waited for his friend to give him the word to stab Mr. Short with a knife he had hidden in his boxer shorts. What started as a bad day for Mr. Short, however, quickly reversed itself. Within minutes of being blindsided in a dead-end corridor, Mr. Short defended himself impressively and fought off his attackers. While a number of other inmates joined the fracas on both sides, Mr. Short reached into his sock and retrieved a makeshift weapon, a shank or shiv, made of sharpened ceramic with a handle. He can be seen on the security camera footage menacing his attackers and making lunging and stabbing motions. One of Mr. Short's attackers ended up with lacerations across his back, while another ended up with a number of cuts and a puncture wound. Mr. Short himself ended up with a neck wound. Mr. Short has been charged with 4 counts, 1 count of assault and 1 count of assault with a weapon, in respect of each of his 2 fellow inmates who mounted the attack on him. So assault and assault with a weapon on each of the 2 people, so a total of 4 counts. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds like a pretty terrible day. He's being ambushed, but I bet he's feeling pretty good to be alive and in a position to be charged with these offenses. It seems from the recitation of the facts here that it's quite likely that they intended to kill him, and he's avoided that. And at the end of the day, they've decided to proceed with charges against him because of this action, and the question is going to be whether or not they can prove that he was using this force, and also whether this was self-defense. So the lead attacker, the Crown subpoenaed East Detention Centre inmate Shamar Brown. In his testimony at trial, Mr. Brown conceded that he had planned and carried out the surprise attack on Mr. Short. He stated that he is a member of the Malvern gang, and that he understood that Mr. Short is a member of the Galloway gang. Both of those gangs have their home bases in Toronto's East End and are longtime rivals. Mr. Brown testified that, as far as the Malvern members are concerned, any member of Galloway is open to being set upon and beaten, or worse. And he also testifies that they hadn't talked, he just had heard that Mr. Short was a gang member. It's not actually clear whether Mr. Short is or isn't, but that was what Mr. Brown thought. Mr. Brown did know that he and Mr. Short were both housed in a range of the jail reserved for so-called STG, Security Threat Group inmates, which generally means gang members. The corrections officers who testified indicated that they're not overly concerned about mixing members of opposing gangs in this way in a single ward or range of the prison. They're apparently more worried about the balance of power and do not want any one gang to dominate any particular range, because then, of course, people are going to start dying, right? Whatever the wisdom of this policy may be, and you can get a sense of what the justice thinks here, right? The court does not think that there's a whole lot of wisdom to this policy. It certainly does not prevent violence in the prison. Mr. Brown testified that he hatched a plan to attack, hurt, and if possible, kill Mr. Short because of what he believed to be Mr. Short's affiliation. To this end, he recruited his friend, inmate Jordan Marcel, to assist him and to carry out the actual knife attack on their victim. Now, I wonder if those two were charged with attempted murder, because I hope so. I hope that they didn't just charge the one side. I suspect that they probably did, but I don't know for certain. Mr. Brown's plan was to pick a fight with Mr. Short when the corrections officers were not looking, and to signal to Mr. Marcel to stab Mr. Short at the appropriate moment. Mr. Brown also indicated that he'd recruited his cellmate to assist him in fighting Mr. Short. And they also note that they expected that a bunch of their gang members would also join in, and that seems to have happened. According to Mr. Brown, most of the inmates at Toronto East Detention Centre are armed with weapons of one form or another. He indicated that he did not have a weapon on him himself at the time of the fight. Instead, he relied on Mr. Marcel to come in with a knife and do the stabbing of Mr. Short. So essentially, he's going to distract Mr. Short by punching him in the face, probably, and Mr. Marcel is going to stab him from behind, which actually seems like a pretty effective ambush plan. I certainly wouldn't want to be jumped in such a fashion myself, and I highly doubt I would have done as well in that circumstance as Mr. Short did. I kind of suspect that if somebody, carried out this plan against me, I would probably be dead. So Mr. Brown was, however, prepared for his performance. He can be seen in the security video taken that day wearing long protective sleeves made of heavy material to prevent lacerations and other wounds on his arms from the kinds of sharp objects often wielded by inmates. After throwing several punches at Mr. Short and catching him by surprise, Mr. Brown shouted, "Stab him! Stab him!" This was his signal to Mr. Marcel to move in with the knife and do as much damage to Mr. Short as possible. That's a really subtle signal, right? Who would have heard this? Shout it out. Yeah, not a lot of subtlety there, and this isn't terribly surprising when you look at sort of the inmate population. But yeah, so Mr. Brown himself was stabbed and cut several places during the fight and required hospitalization and stitches, but he said he didn't know who stabbed him. And that might be because he didn't know, or it might be because people in custody are often really reluctant to point the finger at anybody, including people who've attacked them with weapons, because you don't want to get known for that. So without going into sort of too much detail there, it can be unsafe to do so. All right, and they also note that Mr. Brown started the entire melee by punching Mr. Short when he was not looking. And yeah, so it wasn't even like a fair fight to start. He just, sucker punches him. So the second attacker, the Crown also subpoenaed Jordan Marcel. The security video shows Mr. Marcel standing as if on guard just before the fight broke out, ensuring that the area of the planned attack is clear of correctional officers before Mr. Brown starts pummeling Mr. Short. Once the fight starts, Mr. Marcel can be seen entering into the fray and pulling men off of Mr. Brown and trying to isolate Mr. Short. Mr. Marcel testified that he weighs 280 pounds. He is by any measure an imposing man and obviously has a commanding presence in the crowd of inmates involved in the fight. He participated in this ruckus without a shirt on, explaining on the witness stand that if he is bare-chested, it is harder for an opponent to grab onto him during a close skirmish. So I have no idea what that would have looked like, but, big muscular guy apparently going in shirtless. And I mean, I guess that's kind of brave if everyone's swinging knives around, but yeah. Mr. Marcel testified that he has intentionally tried to cultivate the aura of a tough man whom other inmates should fear. It is safe to say that he's been successful in achieving that goal. He also testified that he's always loyal to his fellow gang members. When Mr. Brown asked him to join in beating Mr. Short, he agreed without hesitation and without asking any questions. Yeah, sure, let's go beat somebody up. Prison's not a nice place. Try to avoid going there. Just pro tip, don't do things that get you sent to places like this, because they're real crappy to be in. All right. Now, he testified that he went into the fight with his knife in his shorts, but that at the end of the fight, he was not sure what happened to it. He speculated that he may have dropped it at some point. If that is the case, then one of the other inmates no doubt picked it up and kept it, talking about his knife. So the head of security for Toronto East Detention Centre, Sergeant John Lawson, great name for that, Lawson, testified that a search was done after the incident and no weapons were found. That, of course, is rather remarkable, since all three inmates testified that the facility is rife with weapons of all varieties. Even Sergeant Lawson conceded that the East is a violent place with many inmates having weapons, but of course, they found none of them. So who knows where those weapons went, but I'm guessing they didn't just vanish into the air. I'm guessing they were available for later use. So talking about Mr. Short now, they note he has scars from knives or makeshift shivs and shanks on his neck, back, head, arms, forehead, and the side of his face. He described a history of being blindsided and attacked for reasons that are obscure to all but the members of the various groups and gangs in the given facilities. And so, yeah, he's been around the block in terms of these sorts of struggles and fights. And as for the East, Mr. Brown and Mr. Marcel confirm Mr. Short's observation that the inmates there are armed to the teeth. The inability of the corrections officers to find any weapons in a place apparently bristling with weapons is emblematic of what is seen in the video. You can see there's some disapproval here from the court, right? The court's got some opinions. None of the correctional officers seem to notice that Mr. Brown came out of his cell wearing padded sleeves when everyone else is in short-sleeve prison outfits, or that Mr. Marcel was standing guard at the entrance to an isolated corridor without a shirt on when everyone else was fully clothed. Now, this just brings up, just as a general self-defense kind of thing, it's really important that you maintain some situational awareness. You be aware of what's going on around you, and when kind of the tone or the flavor of things changes a bit, because if you walk into a scenario and suddenly it just feels different, that's something you should pin down and try to figure out what's going on, or maybe get out of there. But, you know, we've got Mr. Brown coming out wearing essentially armor, and Mr. Marcel, I don't know how often it is that people are hanging around shirtless there. I can't speculate on that, but for Mr. Marcel, at least, this was sort of how he goes to fight. So, you know, the correctional officers kind of dropped the ball on the situational awareness here. I think Mr. Short might have as well, because, you know, these are things that maybe he could have noticed. But regardless, the court has some thoughts about what's going on in this particular facility. They say, perhaps watching a video of what is now obviously the minutes preceding a surprise attack is unfair to the correctional officers who did not have the benefit of hindsight. However, no one seems to have paid any attention to some obvious signs of trouble. So the court yields that, you know, we have the benefit of knowing that there was going to be a fight, because otherwise, why would there be charges? But it does seem strange, right? And if this is stuff that's happening all the time, it kind of raises the question of, why is that too? All right, carrying on here. Once the fight started, it lasted a surprisingly long time before any of the officers arrived on the scene to stop it. There was enough time for Mr. Short to be jumped, for a fist fight to ensue, for Mr. Marcel to get involved blocking and pulling inmates away, for Mr. Short to exit the crowd briefly and pull his shiv out of his sock, for another fight to ensue between Mr. Short and Mr. Brown in the middle of a larger crowd that is caught up in the brawl, and for side fights to erupt in the bathroom and elsewhere in the vicinity. Now, in fairness to the correctional officers here, once everything is exploding, I'm sure they're, grabbing gear and running out there as quickly as they can, but it's going to be hard to deal with all of this stuff that's exploding at once. And although listing all of these things makes it sound long, I'm guessing this was less than a minute. I mean, I'm guessing that this was all pretty fast. So I kind of want to be fair to the correctional officers here. I'm guessing this was a pretty, a surprisingly long time. Might have been a minute or minutes rather than, any sort of, I don't think it would have been 10 minutes, for instance. But, I mean, the point still remains is that if you're actually attacked in a violent confrontation, even with officers, probably like less than 100 feet away, you're still the first person who's got to deal with that. The notion that a police officer is going to arrive in time to save you from a violent attack if you're not able to save yourself from it is really, I think, a fiction. Had Mr. Short not been armed, he probably would not be alive. So, I don't know. I haven't looked out my window, but I'm gonna bet that there's more than 100 feet between me and the nearest cop right now. That's just a hunch. I'm not gonna go and look out the windows, but I would put substantial money on that. And if there is one within 100 feet, wait a couple minutes and I'm sure he will have, driven a little further. All right. Eventually, officers arrive with pepper spray and manage to subdue the crowd, but the control they exert seems lackadaisical at best. It is certainly the case that any inmate who is the target of an attack would have to fend for himself. Relying on the correctional officers to intervene appears to be a formula for a trip to the hospital or the morgue. This atmosphere is self-evident in the video and confirms what Mr. Short said in his testimony, that unfortunately an inmate who feels in danger from attack or who, like Mr. Short, has a history of being attacked in jail needs to carry a concealed weapon in order to feel safe. Now, I mean, this really applies to anybody who might be attacked. It's just that Mr. Short is in a more dangerous environment, but that doesn't mean that other people aren't in danger, either because, they might have a crazy violent ex, or they might live in a very bad neighborhood of town. But we're expected to not do what Mr. Short did. Mr. Short has a weapon. The rest of us sort of can't. Yeah, as you can tell, I've got some opinions on that as well. Now, I'm going to skip over some of this just because they talk about how it's difficult to identify who actually inflicted the wounds on Mr. Marcel's. So the Crown is unable to prove that that Mr. Short is the one who inflicted those injuries, but ultimately they determined that that there is enough evidence to determine that Mr. Short was the cause of Mr. Brown's injuries. They say, having examined the security video closely and in slow motion, I'm of the view that indeed Mr. Short was the cause of Mr. Brown's slashing and puncture wounds. And they note that if one looks very carefully and freezes the frames at the precise second, one can see Mr. Short's arm extended and aimed at Mr. Brown in a stabbing posture. So they determined that Mr. Short stabbed Mr. Brown. Fair enough. Which leads us, of course, to the next question, which is, if he stabbed him, was this use of force justified in some fashion? And the only justification really that's going to be on the table for Mr. Short is self-defense. That's what he's arguing here. And yeah, so we'll have a look at the court applying the self-defense tests here. They say, as for whether the third criterion for self-defense under section 34(1)(c), I might have skipped over some here, but they noted that in terms of section 34 sub 1 sub A and B, so the first two criteria, they note that while he fought with Mr. Brown, Mr. Short believed on reasonable grounds that force was being used against him, because of course it was, right? I mean, he's being attacked, so this isn't a situation where he's apprehending an attack or thinks he's being attacked, but he's wrong. And, so he's using the force in order to repel the force that Mr. Brown was already using against him. Those are sort of the first two portions of the test for self-defense. Usually those are fairly easy to make out, and that's why the third element here is more lengthy, and this is often where a self-defense claim fails. As for whether the third criterion for self-defense under section 34(1)(c) of the Criminal Code is satisfied, i.e. that Mr. Short's use of force was reasonable in the circumstances, I'm required to measure his actions against the matters set out in section 34 sub 2 as follows. So the Criminal Code specifies a bunch of things that the court should think about. It's not an exhaustive list. The court could consider other stuff, but these are things that the court must at least turn their mind to. So first, the nature of the force or threat, and keep in mind, these are people who were planning to kill him. And their plan is a fairly well thought out one. They're going to ambush him from two sides and he's going to get stabbed in the back. Meanwhile, he's going to be distracted by a guy in the front who's wearing armor so he can sort of stand up to whatever fight Mr. Short might put up. That seems to me like a pretty extreme threat, right? That's top of the top of the concern scale. So B, the nature or the extent to which the use of force was imminent, and whether there were other means available to respond to the potential use of force. This is happening imminently. This is right away. And, it's not like he's going to be able to call, call the police and ask them to help out here. By the time he knows what's going on, there's people trying to kill him. The person's role in the incident. I mean, we can say he's not a complete innocent in the sense that he's in a prison, he's got a knife, but he's certainly not, with respect to this incident, he doesn't seem to start anything. He finishes it, but he doesn't start it. If the other people had decided not to try to kill him, it's probably the case that nothing would have happened on this particular incident. So whether any party to the incident used or threatened to use a weapon, his attackers certainly used or threatened to use a weapon, and so did he. So this one's kind of a wash, except for the fact that, when we look at how this is going, they were the people who started it, and they're trying to stab him in the back. The size, age, gender, and physical capabilities of the party to the incident, or parties to the incident. We don't know about everybody's physical capabilities or size, but we do know about one of them, and he's apparently a mountain of a man. He's a great big giant, and so it sounds like Mr. Short might have been outmassed. The nature, duration, and history of any relationship between the parties to the incident, including any prior use or threat of force, and the nature of that force or threat. We've heard about that in terms of this ongoing tension that's happening within this facility. Any history of interaction or communication between the parties to the incident. We've heard that they haven't actually spoken. Mr. Brown decides to kill him just because he hears that he's a member of a different gang. And we don't even know if he was or wasn't. The nature and proportionality of the person's response to the use or threat of force seems fairly, proportional. He's being attacked by two people, one of whom has a knife. He's one person with a knife. I think, if anything, he's got less force than the other side. And whether the act was committed was in response to a use or threat of force that the person knew was lawful. And here it's quite the opposite. He knew it was not lawful. Now, if he'd pulled out his knife in terms of responding to a corrections officer, then that one would be a big problem for him. But when we look at all of those factors, sounds to me like Mr. Short is really doing pretty good on this, right? Everything seems to be coming up Mr. Short for this legal test. So let's see what the court says. Given the circumstances of the fight that Mr. Short found himself in, a prison fight against a rival gang in the STG part of the jail where people are blatantly trying to kill him with knives or shivs, these criteria are readily inclined to his favor. There's nothing unreasonable about Mr. Short using a weapon of his own to defend himself. The system put him in this situation, and the system cannot blame him for resorting to his own means of defense. And I mean, that's a pretty snarky comment here. He's been basically pointing out, listen, they've let things run wild here. Is he expected to just die? Like, is that what we expect of him? Is just clearly not, right? So the Crown's entire case rests on section 34 sub 2 sub G, the proportionality of Mr. Short's response to the force used against him. Specifically, counsel for the Crown points out that after his first reaction to being assaulted, Mr. Short can be seen stepping away from the center of the fight and removing the shiv from his sock. He then steps back into the fray when, Crown counsel contends, he could have walked the other way and escaped the fight. That's an interesting argument, and I haven't seen this video, and I don't have this video to review with us, so let's see what the court says. This movement in and out of the tight circle of fighters was demonstrated in court by Crown counsel, who slowed the video speed down to 1/4 speed, and this is something that should generally be pushed back against whenever it happens in court, because when you're talking about a self-defense case, self-defense doesn't happen at 1/4 speed. It happens at full speed, and it doesn't happen in the comfort of a courtroom. It happens, in a very tense situation. It's agitated. You're going to probably have tunnel vision. Adrenaline does a whole bunch of things to your decision making because it's basically your body trying to focus you in on, not getting killed by whatever's trying to kill you. You don't necessarily make 100% perfect decisions in that, and you certainly don't get to slow time. So the court continues on. This allowed the viewer to ascertain the exact moment when Mr. Short could have made a different decision than the one that he made to continue fighting Mr. Brown. Mr. Short was asked about this decision to re-enter the fight when it seems he could have fled the corridor where the melee was taking place. His response was that he did not make a conscious decision to continue fighting, but rather made an instinctive decision that the fight was not yet over. That's pretty much how your decision-making would go if you're in a situation where you're being attacked with knives. He embellished this response by explaining that had he tried to run away at this point, before the correctional officers had subdued his adversaries, someone would likely have come after him, and he would have been in a position of such weakness that he would have put his life in jeopardy. Given his long experience of knife fights in a prison setting, Mr. Short speaks with some authority on the subject. I really hope Mr. Short at some point manages to parlay this into being an expert witness on prison knife fights. But when you think about it, it makes sense, right? If you run down this corridor away from from the big brawl where the corrections officers are headed, you have the real potential to be off away from everything else, getting stabbed to death, and the corrections officers are busy dealing with the big fight while you're bleeding out in a hallway. Now, counsel for defense is going to get some snark in here as well, and the court is going to repeat it. So counsel for the defense adds to this by saying, somewhat facetiously, if we could slow down life like we can slow down the video to 1/4 speed, then Mr. Short could have measured properly when to stop using his knife. Love it. That's a great line. Mr. Short testified that he was acting on adrenaline and effectively on autopilot and had no time to contemplate the niceties of how he was conducting his self-defense. And also, if you got to think about it, if the route he's supposed to take is behind him, how do you know that there's an opening to leave from behind you? You're certainly not going to turn your back on an upraised knife. That would be crazy, right? So there could be all sorts of escape routes behind you, but unless you somehow know they're there, and know that it's safe to run away, getting stabbed in the back is not a great plan for life. Defense counsel makes the point that the Crown is imposing unrealistic strictures on the way self-defense was supposed to work here. Mr. Short cannot be expected to have weighed the proportionality of his response with any precision in the heat of the moment when he's under ongoing attack. Having considered all of the criteria set out in section 34 sub 2, I conclude that Mr. Short acted in self-defense in using force and a makeshift weapon against Mr. Brown, and so therefore he's found not guilty of all charges. And I think this is a good ruling. I mean, some people will say, I'm sure there'll be somebody in the comments saying, I have no sympathy for Mr. Short. He got in there doing bad stuff, and I don't know if he was, I don't know if he was guilty at this point or if he was just awaiting trial. But, people might say, listen, we think Mr. Short is a bad guy, and, we don't care what happens to him. Well, even bad people have rights. And the other thing to consider, as I mentioned in the last prison knife fight video I did, it's kind of interesting how there's a lot of cases on that. The principles that get applied to a prisoner also get applied to somebody who's walking down the street. And if this really clear example of self-defense was found to be not self-defense in this case, you better believe that they would be bringing that out. For instance, if I was walking down the street and somebody, tried to attack me and I fought back in some fashion, whether with a knife or without, if the person was injured, they'd be saying, listen, this guy who was in the middle of people trying to actively murder him wasn't properly self-defense. How can Runkle claim this is self-defense? So it is important. I mean, this is one of the things people ask me, how can you be a defense lawyer? You know, you're defending bad people. Well, in defending bad people, you often defend the rights that are necessary for good people to, you know, to survive and thrive. So I want to commend the Defense Council. It sounds like they did a really great job on this one. And I'll, you know, shout him out by name here. It's Robert E. Costello was apparently Defense Counsel. And it sounds like he did a really good job. And I'm glad for it, because my rights and your rights are also going to be affected by this. Anyway, I thought this is a fun case. Somebody sent this case to me, and when I read it, I was like, I got to share it with you guys, because it's interesting on the self-defense aspect, and it's also just, you can kind of feel that the court maybe thinks that this was not the best case to bring to court, and I kind of agree with them. I don't know. I haven't seen the video. I don't know how that shakes out, but yeah. Anyway, let me know in the comments what you think. Please like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to see more content. I also want to thank my Patreon supporters at the $50 level, Canada's National Firearms Association, the CCFR, and the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. At the $30 level, Sights and Arms Limited and Marc-Olivier Demour. And at the $20 level, Peter Hilger, Mark, Jane Babe and Luxor, Haywire, Dale Nesbitt, Cameron Johnson, Bruno R., Andrew Elsich, and Rick J.D. Thank you as well to the $10 supporters who will be in the crawl immediately following. Thank you for watching, and I hope this has armed you with knowledge.